Early October 1941. The air was crisp with the chill of early autumn as General Erich Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group advanced through the vast Russian plains. It was October 1941, and the Eastern Front of World War II was in the throes of one of its most pivotal moments. The German forces were driving relentlessly eastward as part of Operation Typhoon, their sights set on the Soviet capital, Moscow. The road to Vyazma. The terrain was a mix of open fields and sparse forests, punctuated by small villages that seemed to offer little resistance. The German tanks, powerful and fast, cut through the landscape with precision. Hoepner's 4th Panzer Group, a formidable force of armored divisions, was making significant strides. Vyazma, a key city located about halfway between Smolensk and Moscow, was a strategic point on their route. By early October, the 4th Panzer Group had succeeded in encircling Soviet forces at Vyazma, cutting off their escape routes and trapping them within a growing pocket. The encirclement was a major tactical achievement, designed to crush the trapped Soviet forces by squeezing them from all sides. The encirclement completed. On October 6th, Hoepner's troops completed the encirclement, effectively isolating a significant portion of the Soviet 16th and 19th Armies. This success was a testament to the efficiency and speed of the German advance. The Soviets, caught off guard by the rapid movement and the effectiveness of the encirclement, were now trapped in a dire situation. Hoepner's face bore a look of satisfaction as he reviewed the progress. The encirclement had been executed with precision, and the trapped Soviet forces were now cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The next step was to clear the pocket and eliminate the trapped Soviet troops. Tensions with high command. Despite the success, the mood among the German commanders was not entirely positive. Hoepner's superior, General Gunther von Kluge, had issued orders to pause the advance. Kluge, commanding the 4th Army, was concerned about the risk of Soviet forces breaking out from the encirclement or mounting counterattacks. Hoepner, in a letter to his wife dated October 6th, expressed his frustration with the pause in the advance. "We have completed the encirclement at Vyazma, but we are being held back. My units are ready and able to clear the pocket and continue the advance toward Moscow. This pause is unnecessary and hinders our progress." The struggle for fuel. The pause in the advance came at a cost. Hoepner's units were experiencing severe shortages of fuel. The 11th Panzer Division, in particular, reported having no fuel at all. The supply lines, already stretched thin, were struggling to keep up with the demands of the rapidly advancing forces. The fuel shortages were a critical issue. The Panzer divisions relied heavily on fuel to maintain their mobility and effectiveness. Without adequate fuel, the tanks and vehicles could not perform at their best, and the advance was slowed further. The weather takes its toll. The weather also began to play a significant role in the campaign. Early October brought heavy rains that turned the roads into quagmires, making movement even more challenging. The once firm terrain was now a mix of mud and water, creating a sluggish and difficult environment for the German forces. Hoepner's staff officers reported frequent damage to the tracked vehicles and motor transport. The worsening road conditions compounded the difficulties, making it harder for the troops to advance and sustain their operations. The Soviet response. While Hoepner's forces grappled with the challenges of encirclement and supply issues, the Soviet response was taking shape. The Red Army, despite being encircled, was not idle. Soviet forces within the pocket were organizing their defenses and preparing for a desperate fight to break free. The Soviets understood the gravity of their situation and were determined to resist. They began launching counterattacks and attempting to exploit any weaknesses in the German encirclement. The fierce Soviet resistance was a clear sign that the battle for Vyazma would be far from easy. Hoepner's resolve. Despite the challenges, Hoepner remained resolute. The encirclement at Vyazma was a significant achievement, but it was only the first step in a much larger campaign. The goal was to clear the pocket, eliminate the trapped Soviet forces, and continue the advance toward Moscow. Hoepner's determination was evident in his actions and decisions. He worked tirelessly to address the supply issues, coordinate with his units, and ensure that the encirclement was maintained. His focus was on achieving the next phase of the operation and overcoming the obstacles that lay ahead. The path forward. As October progressed, the situation at Vyazma remained fluid. The encircled Soviet forces were fighting fiercely, and the weather was becoming increasingly problematic. Hoepner knew that the coming days would be crucial in determining the success of the operation. The path forward was fraught with challenges, but Hoepner's commitment to the mission was unwavering. The encirclement at Vyazma was a testament to the effectiveness of the German offensive, but it was also a reminder of the difficulties and complexities of war. The road to Moscow was long and arduous, and the battle for Vyazma was only the beginning. Hoepner and his troops were prepared to face the trials ahead, determined to achieve their objectives and secure victory in the face of adversity. Mid-October 1941. As October progressed, the initial euphoria of the Vyazma encirclement began to wane, replaced by the sobering reality of logistical strains that threatened to undermine the German advance toward Moscow. General Erich Hoepner, already dealing with the complexities of winter warfare, now faced a daunting challenge: the effective management of resources in a campaign that was rapidly becoming more difficult and resource-intensive. The pressing issue of fuel. The success of the Vyazma encirclement had come at a price. While the tactical maneuver was a significant achievement, it left Hoepner's panzer group grappling with critical shortages, most notably of fuel. The 11th Panzer Division, which had been instrumental in completing the encirclement, reported that it was running on empty. Fuel reserves were alarmingly low across the entire group. Hoepner's logistics officer, Colonel Ludwig Schiller, presented the grim reality in a briefing. "General, our supply lines are struggling to keep up with the demand. The fuel situation is dire. The 11th Panzer Division is effectively immobilized, and other units are facing severe shortages. If we cannot address this issue quickly, our ability to continue the advance will be severely compromised." Hoepner's face tightened with concern as he absorbed the report. Fuel was the lifeblood of the panzer divisions. Without it, the tanks and vehicles that were crucial to their offensive operations would be rendered ineffective. The challenge was not merely obtaining the fuel, but ensuring that it could be delivered to the front lines in a timely manner. The logistical bottleneck. The logistics of war were proving to be a formidable adversary. The extensive German supply lines, which stretched back to the rear areas and relied on a network of railways and roads, were increasingly strained by the rapid advance and the demands of winter conditions. The roads, once navigable, had become a morass of mud and slush due to heavy rains. With the onset of colder weather, these roads were beginning to freeze, but the damage done by the rains had created treacherous conditions. Vehicles and supply trucks struggled through the mud, and the cold further complicated their journey, causing mechanical failures and delays. Hoepner met with his supply officers to discuss the situation. "We need to find a way to expedite our fuel deliveries and address the mechanical issues with our vehicles. If we cannot get our logistics under control, we risk stalling the entire operation." Colonel Schiller proposed several measures to mitigate the crisis. "We are working to prioritize fuel deliveries to the most critical units. Additionally, we're establishing forward supply depots closer to the front to reduce the distance fuel must travel. We are also increasing maintenance efforts to keep our vehicles operational." Winter's unforgiving grip. As the weather worsened, the challenges of winter warfare became more apparent. The encirclement at Vyazma had exposed the German forces to the full brunt of Russian autumn and winter. The cold was not merely a discomfort, but a severe obstacle that impacted every aspect of the campaign. The troops, already fatigued from the constant advance and combat, were now facing the added burden of inadequate winter clothing and gear. The harsh temperatures made it difficult for soldiers to stay warm, leading to cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Hoepner's command post was a hive of activity as efforts were made to address these issues. Supplies of winter gear, including heavy coats, boots, and blankets, were being rushed to the front lines. Despite these efforts, the soldiers remained vulnerable to the extreme conditions. The Soviets' resilient defense. The Soviet forces, though encircled, were far from defeated. The Soviets had used the time within the pocket to strengthen their defenses and prepare for counterattacks. Reports from the front lines indicated that Soviet troops were mounting increasingly effective resistance, taking advantage of the harsh weather and the difficult terrain. The Red Army's resilience was a constant reminder of the challenge Hoepner and his forces faced. The Soviets were not only defending their positions, but also working to break out of the encirclement and disrupt the German supply lines. Hoepner's determination. Despite the mounting challenges, Hoepner's resolve remained steadfast. He understood that the logistical issues and the harsh weather were significant obstacles, but he was determined to find solutions and maintain the momentum of the campaign. In his diary, Hoepner wrote, "The strain on our logistics is severe and the weather is unrelenting, but we must persevere. Our success at Vyazma has given us a foothold, and we cannot afford to let these challenges deter us from our objective. We must address these issues head-on and continue to push forward." Strategic adjustments. Recognizing the severity of the situation, Hoepner and his staff began making strategic adjustments. The focus shifted to consolidating their gains and fortifying their positions. Efforts were made to improve supply routes and ensure that essential resources, particularly fuel, reached the front lines more efficiently. Hoepner also began to consider alternative strategies to deal with the Soviet resistance and the logistical difficulties. The possibility of a temporary pause to allow for resupply and reorganization was on the table, but Hoepner remained committed to finding ways to sustain the offensive. A hard winter ahead. As October gave way to November, the reality of winter warfare settled in. The challenges of logistics, weather, and Soviet resistance were becoming increasingly apparent. Hoepner and his troops faced a difficult road ahead, with the promise of a hard winter and the need to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. Hoepner's leadership and resourcefulness would be tested in the coming days. The strain of logistics was a formidable challenge, but it was one that Hoepner was determined to overcome. The path to Moscow remained fraught with obstacles, but the resolve to press on was unyielding. Late October 1941. The days of October were slipping by, with the cold of winter tightening its grip, and General Erich Hoepner found himself embroiled in a new battle not with the Soviets, but with his superior, General Gunther von Kluge. The friction between them had reached a boiling point, exacerbated by the operational challenges and the growing urgency to push toward Moscow. Tensions rise. The encirclement at Vyazma, while a strategic triumph, had not come without its issues. Hoepner's units were bogged down by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the encroaching cold. Despite these obstacles, Hoepner was resolute in his belief that the advance toward Moscow should continue. However, Kluge, commanding the Fourth Army, had different ideas. Kluge had ordered a pause in the advance to consolidate the gains made at Vyazma and to prevent Soviet forces from breaking out. To Hoepner, this decision was a source of mounting frustration. He believed that the momentum achieved from the encirclement could be used to maintain the pressure on the Soviets and drive towards Moscow without delay. In a tense meeting at Kluge's headquarters, the air was thick with disagreement. Hoepner's frustration was palpable as he presented his case. "General Kluge, our forces are ready to advance. We've achieved a significant encirclement, and the momentum is on our side. Pausing now only gives the Soviets more time to regroup and strengthen their defenses." Kluge, seated behind a large oak desk, looked up with a calm but firm expression. "Erich, I understand your urgency, but we must ensure that we're not overextending ourselves. The risk of Soviet breakout attempts is real, and our supply lines are under severe strain. We need to consolidate our gains and prepare for the next phase." strategic differences. Hoepner's argument was grounded in a belief that the strategic advantage gained from encircling Vyazma should not be squandered. He viewed the pause as a bureaucratic hindrance that was unnecessarily delaying the advance. To him, the operational risks of moving forward outweighed the benefits of consolidating. Kluge, on the other hand, was more focused on the broader operational picture. His strategy was to secure the rear areas and ensure that the supply lines were stable before resuming the advance. This approach, while cautious, aimed to prevent any catastrophic failures that could jeopardize the overall campaign. In his letter to his wife, dated October 20th, Hoepner expressed his growing exasperation. The pause ordered by Kluge is a bitter pill to swallow. Our units are ready, and the Soviets are still reeling from our encirclement. It feels as though our progress is being needlessly hampered, and I am deeply frustrated by this. The consequences of delay. The decision to pause had practical consequences that quickly became apparent. The fuel shortages, which had been somewhat managed during the pause, continued to affect the mobility of the panzer divisions. The worsening weather conditions were making the roads increasingly impassable, and the time spent waiting was not benefiting the operational tempo. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, were making the most of the lull in the German advance. They used the time to fortify their positions, regroup, and plan counterattacks. Reports from the front indicated that the Soviets were preparing for a renewed offensive, and the opportunity to maintain the initiative was slipping away. Hoepner's leadership under pressure. Despite the strategic disagreements with Kluge, Hoepner remained focused on leading his troops effectively. He continued to work tirelessly to address the logistical issues and maintain morale among his men. His leadership was critical in managing the challenges posed by the fuel shortages and the harsh weather. Hoepner also began to explore alternative strategies to address the situation. He pushed for increased efforts to repair and maintain the vehicles and sought ways to optimize the use of available fuel. Additionally, he coordinated with his supply officers to streamline the distribution of resources. In a meeting with his senior staff, Hoepner addressed the situation with determination. "We are facing significant challenges, but we must adapt and overcome them. We need to ensure that our forces are as prepared as possible for the next phase of the operation. Our goal remains the same: to push forward and seize the initiative." The struggle to rescale objectives. As October drew to a close, the friction between Hoepner and Kluge remained unresolved. The strategic disagreements were a source of tension, but Hoepner understood the need to work within the constraints of the broader operational framework. Hoepner began to reassess the objectives of the campaign in light of the current conditions. The possibility of a temporary realignment of goals was considered, with a focus on consolidating gains and preparing for a more sustained push once the logistical and operational issues were addressed. In his diary, Hoepner reflected on the situation. "The friction with Kluge is a challenge, but it is also a part of the broader struggle of war. We must navigate these difficulties and adapt our strategies to the changing circumstances. Our resolve must remain firm, and our efforts must be directed towards achieving our ultimate objective." Moving forward. As November approached, Hoepner and his staff continued to grapple with the operational challenges and the strategic disagreements. The friction with Kluge was a reminder of the complexities of command and the need for adaptability in the face of adversity. Despite the obstacles, Hoepner's determination remained unwavering. He was committed to finding a way forward, addressing the logistical issues, and preparing his forces for the next phase of the campaign. The road to Moscow was long and fraught with difficulties, but Hoepner was resolved to navigate the challenges and continue the fight. The friction with Kluge was just one of many obstacles, but it was a reminder of the importance of leadership and the need to persevere in the face of adversity. Early November 1941. November had arrived, bringing with it a stark transformation in the Russian landscape. General Erich Hoepner and his 4th Panzer Group, though still grappling with the strategic and logistical strains of their campaign, were now confronted by the harsh reality of the Russian winter. What was initially perceived as the advantage of frozen ground quickly revealed itself to be a treacherous illusion. The promise of frost. In the early days of November, the German forces looked upon the freezing temperatures with a sense of cautious optimism. The muddy roads that had hindered their advance throughout October were beginning to solidify. The frost promised to turn the treacherous quagmires of autumn into firm, navigable surfaces that would allow their tanks and vehicles to move more easily. Hoepner, in a strategic briefing, expressed his hopes. The onset of frost is a promising development. If the ground solidifies, our tanks and vehicles should be able to move with greater ease. This could provide us with the momentum we need to push forward and achieve our objective. The initial signs seemed encouraging. The first layers of frost began to form on the roads and fields, creating a solid surface that appeared to be more stable than the muddy terrain of the previous weeks. For a brief moment, it seemed that the harsh conditions might finally play in favor of the advancing German forces. The reality of frozen terrain. However, as November progressed, it became evident that the promise of frozen ground was not as advantageous as anticipated. The German forces soon discovered that the reality of the winter landscape was fraught with challenges of its own. The freezing temperatures had caused the previously muddy roads to solidify, but this solidification was not uniform. Some areas became hard and navigable, while others remained dangerously uneven and prone to ice patches. The inconsistency in the terrain created hazardous conditions for the tanks and vehicles, which were now at risk of slipping or becoming stuck. Hoepner's optimism began to wane as reports from the front lines highlighted the difficulties. The ground may be frozen, but the conditions are far from ideal. Our vehicles are still encountering difficulties, and the uneven surface is causing problems with mobility. The impact on mobility. The issues with mobility were compounded by the fact that the frozen ground, while providing a firmer surface, also led to mechanical issues for the German tanks and vehicles. The extreme cold was causing engines to fail and components to freeze, further exacerbating the logistical challenges. Hoepner's staff officers reported frequent breakdowns and mechanical failures. The cold is affecting our engines and transmission systems. We're seeing an increase in breakdowns, and maintenance crews are struggling to keep up with the repairs. The situation was becoming increasingly dire. The initial advantage of frozen ground was overshadowed by the practical difficulties of maintaining and operating the vehicles in the harsh winter conditions. The progress that had been anticipated was proving to be elusive. Soviet resilience and counterattacks. As the German forces struggled with the challenges of the frozen ground, the Soviet resistance continued to strengthen. The Red Army, having used the time during the German pause to regroup and fortify their positions, was now launching increasingly effective counterattacks. Reports from the front lines indicated that the Soviets were taking advantage of the harsh conditions to launch surprise attacks and disrupt the German advance. Their knowledge of the terrain and experience with winter warfare gave them a significant advantage. Hoepner was acutely aware of the growing Soviet resistance. The Soviets are proving to be resilient. They are adapting to the conditions and mounting effective counterattacks. We need to adjust our strategies and find a way to overcome these obstacles. The strain on resources. The logistical strains continued to affect the German campaign. The supply lines, already stretched thin, were struggling to cope with the demands of winter warfare. The transportation of fuel, ammunition, and other supplies was becoming increasingly challenging due to the frozen and uneven terrain. Hoepner and his staff worked tirelessly to address these issues. They prioritized the repair and maintenance of vehicles, sought to optimize supply routes, and attempted to manage the flow of resources more effectively. Despite their efforts, the strain on resources was taking a toll on the overall effectiveness of the campaign. Reassessing the strategy. With the realization that the frozen ground was not providing the expected advantage, Hoepner and his staff began to reassess their strategy. The focus shifted to adapting to the harsh winter conditions and finding ways to sustain the offensive despite the logistical and operational challenges. Hoepner's leadership was critical in navigating these difficulties. He worked closely with his staff to develop new strategies and adjust their approach to the changing conditions. The goal remained to push forward and achieve the objectives of the campaign, but the path forward was now more complicated than anticipated. In a strategic meeting, Hoepner addressed his staff. "The frozen ground has not been the advantage we hoped for, but we must adapt. Our strategy must evolve to meet the realities of winter warfare. We need to find a way to maintain our momentum and continue the advance despite the challenges." The road ahead. As November continued, the German forces faced an increasingly difficult situation. The illusion of frozen ground had given way to the harsh reality of winter warfare. The challenges of mobility, resource management, and Soviet resistance were becoming more pronounced. Hoepner's determination remained steadfast. He was committed to overcoming the obstacles and finding a way to push forward. The road to Moscow was fraught with difficulties, but Hoepner and his troops were resolved to navigate the challenges and continue their fight. The path ahead was uncertain, but Hoepner's leadership and adaptability would be crucial in determining the success of the campaign. The illusion of frozen ground had faded, but the resolve to achieve their objectives remained strong. Late November 1941. As November drew to a close, the chilling winds of winter swept through the Russian plains, casting an icy pall over the battlefield. General Erich Hoepner and his 4th Panzer Group faced an increasingly dire situation. After weeks of friction with General Kluge and the harrowing challenges of winter warfare, a decision was made to resume the offensive toward Moscow. The stakes were high, and the weather conditions were far from ideal, but the German command knew that time was running out. A strategic decision. The decision to resume the offensive came after considerable debate and analysis. The pause had allowed for some much-needed consolidation of gains and repair of logistical issues, but it also meant that the Soviets had fortified their defenses and adapted to the conditions. With winter fully upon them and the Soviets strengthening their positions, the German High Command, under immense pressure, ordered Hoepner to push forward once more. In a tense meeting with Kluge, Hoepner was given the green light to proceed. Kluge's demeanor was guarded but resolute. "Erich, we're resuming the offensive. Our forces need to move forward and regain momentum. The situation is critical, and we must press on despite the challenges." Hoepner's response was a mix of determination and frustration. "General Kluge, our forces are prepared. We'll advance, but we need to be realistic about the conditions. The weather and Soviet resistance will be formidable obstacles." Preparing for the push. The resumption of the offensive required meticulous preparation. Hoepner and his staff worked tirelessly to ensure that the forces were ready for the renewed push. The logistical issues that had plagued them earlier were addressed as much as possible. Fuel supplies were prioritized, and maintenance crews worked around the clock to ensure that vehicles were operational. The troops, weary but resolute, were briefed on the new phase of the operation. The message was clear: the offensive was a critical effort to achieve their strategic objectives despite the harsh winter conditions. In a motivational address to his officers, Hoepner emphasized the importance of the upcoming push. "We are facing a critical juncture. The conditions are challenging, but our resolve must be stronger. We are resuming the offensive to secure our objectives and achieve victory. Each of you plays a crucial role in this effort." The start of the offensive. On November 17, 1941, the 4th Panzer Group launched its resumed offensive toward Moscow. The early stages of the push were marked by a cautious optimism. The ground, though still uneven, had solidified somewhat, allowing for improved movement compared to the previous muddy conditions. The German forces advanced with a mix of careful planning and aggressive tactics. The panzer divisions, though still facing logistical constraints, moved forward with the aim of exploiting any weaknesses in the Soviet defenses. The 20th Panzer Division, which had managed to maintain some degree of mobility, played a crucial role in the advance. The offensive began with coordinated attacks aimed at penetrating Soviet lines and pushing deeper into enemy territory. the 4th Panzer Group faced stiff resistance from Soviet forces, who were now well entrenched and prepared for the German push. The challenges of winter warfare. The advance, while initially promising, quickly encountered significant difficulties. The harsh winter weather, with temperatures plummeting and snow beginning to blanket the terrain, added a new layer of complexity to the operations. The frozen ground, though better than the muddy quagmires of October, presented its own set of problems. The tanks and vehicles, despite repairs and maintenance, continued to struggle with mechanical failures due to the extreme cold. The icy conditions made navigation treacherous, and the uneven terrain caused frequent disruptions. The once anticipated advantage of frozen ground now felt like another obstacle in the already challenging environment. Hoepner's frustration grew as reports from the front lines revealed the extent of the difficulties. The weather is taking a toll on our operations. Our vehicles are experiencing breakdowns, and the cold is impacting our effectiveness. We need to adapt our tactics to the conditions. Soviet resistance and counterattacks. As the German forces pressed forward, Soviet resistance proved to be more formidable than anticipated. The Red Army, despite the winter conditions, was determined to defend Moscow and launch counterattacks. Soviet forces, well prepared for winter warfare, mounted strong defensive positions and utilized their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The German offensive was met with intense Soviet counterattacks, which aimed to disrupt the German advance and recapture lost territory. The battles were fierce and costly, with heavy casualties on both sides. Hoepner and his staff worked to counter the Soviet resistance, adjusting their tactics and attempting to exploit any weaknesses in the Soviet defenses. Despite their efforts, the Soviet forces proved to be resilient and adaptable. The strain of sustaining the offensive. Sustaining the offensive became increasingly difficult as the days passed. The logistical challenges continued to strain the German forces, and the harsh winter conditions added to the complexity of the operation. The supply lines, already under pressure, struggled to keep up with the demands of the advancing forces. Hoepner's focus remained on maintaining the momentum of the offensive. He sought ways to optimize resource allocation, streamline supply routes, and ensure that his forces remained as effective as possible despite the challenging conditions. In a meeting with his senior staff, Hoepner emphasized the need to adapt to the evolving situation. We must continue to press forward, but we also need to be realistic about the challenges we face. Our tactics and strategies must evolve to meet the conditions and the determined Soviet resistance. The road ahead. As the end of November approached, the German offensive continued with mixed results. The progress was slower than anticipated, and the challenges of winter warfare and Soviet resistance were proving to be significant obstacles. Hoepner's determination and leadership were crucial in navigating the difficult situation. Despite the setbacks and challenges, he remained committed to the objective of seizing Moscow and achieving victory. The road to Moscow was becoming increasingly arduous, but Hoepner and his forces were resolved to press on. The resumed offensive marked a new phase in the campaign, with the promise of continued effort and adaptation in the face of adversity. December 1941. December had arrived, casting a deeper shadow over the battlefield. The German advance toward Moscow, despite initial successes and renewed efforts, was now mired in the stark realization of its limitations. The harsh winter weather, the formidable Soviet resistance, and logistical strains had combined to create a situation that was increasingly difficult to overcome. General Erich Hoepner and his 4th Panzer Group found themselves grappling with the harsh reality of impending failure. The bitter truth. The initial optimism of resuming the offensive had been quickly overshadowed by the brutal realities of winter warfare. The freezing temperatures had transformed the terrain into a treacherous landscape of ice and snow, and the logistical challenges continued to plague the German forces. Despite their best efforts, progress toward Moscow was slow, and the Soviet resistance showed no signs of weakening. Hoepner, once confident in the ability to drive forward, now faced the bitter truth of the situation. The Soviet defenses were stronger than anticipated, and the German forces were struggling to maintain their momentum. Reports from the front lines painted a grim picture, with slow progress, heavy casualties, and mounting difficulties. In a somber meeting with his senior staff, Hoepner addressed the harsh reality. The situation is not improving. Our progress is slow, and the conditions are worsening. We are facing fierce resistance from the Soviets, and our logistical challenges are proving to be insurmountable. The strain of command. The strain of command was evident in Hoepner's demeanor. The weight of responsibility and the growing realization of failure took a toll on him. The decision to push forward, despite the warnings of logistical issues and the severe winter, had not yielded the results that had been hoped for. The frustration and pressure were palpable. In his personal diary, Hoepner reflected on the situation with a sense of disillusionment. "I cannot deny the reality of our failure. The conditions are unforgiving, and our forces are stretched thin. We are not achieving the progress we anticipated, and the dream of capturing Moscow is slipping away." Soviet resilience and counteroffensives. The Soviet forces, resilient and well-prepared, had mounted effective counteroffensives that further complicated the German situation. The Red Army's knowledge of the terrain and experience with winter warfare allowed them to exploit weaknesses in the German advance. The Soviet counterattacks were fierce and well-coordinated, disrupting German plans and causing significant casualties. Hoepner's forces were engaged in a series of grueling battles against the Soviet counterattacks. The fighting was intense, with heavy losses on both sides. Despite the efforts to adapt tactics and counter the Soviet resistance, the German forces found themselves increasingly on the defensive. The reports from the front lines highlighted the growing difficulty of maintaining the offensive. The Soviet counterattacks are relentless. Our forces are exhausted, and the conditions are taking a toll. We are struggling to hold our positions and continue the advance. The collapse of the offensive. As December progressed, it became clear that the offensive was faltering. The German forces were unable to achieve the decisive breakthroughs needed to encircle Moscow, and the logistical challenges were becoming more acute. The harsh winter conditions, combined with the strong Soviet resistance, had created a situation where the German advance was no longer viable. Hoepner's frustration was compounded by the realization that the campaign was not achieving its objectives. The failure to capture Moscow, despite the considerable effort and resources invested, was a significant blow to the German strategy. In a meeting with General Kluge, Hoepner expressed his concerns. "We are not making the progress we need. The conditions are proving to be insurmountable, and our forces are facing severe difficulties. We need to reassess our strategy and consider the possibility of a strategic withdrawal." The impact on morale. The realization of failure had a profound impact on the morale of the troops. The initial optimism and determination had given way to frustration and despair. The harsh winter, the difficult conditions, and the mounting casualties had taken a toll on the soldiers' spirits. Hoepner and his staff worked to maintain morale and support the troops despite the challenging circumstances. Efforts were made to address the immediate needs of the soldiers, including providing better supplies, improving living conditions, and offering support to those affected by the harsh conditions. Hoepner's leadership remained crucial in navigating the difficult situation. He sought to inspire his troops and provide a sense of purpose despite the setbacks. "We are facing a difficult situation, but our resolve must remain strong. We will continue to fight and adapt to the conditions. Our commitment to our mission remains unwavering." The path forward. As December continued, Hoepner and his staff faced the reality of a failed offensive. The decision was made to halt the push toward Moscow and focus on consolidating positions and preparing for the winter months. The failure to achieve the initial objectives was a sobering reminder of the challenges of warfare and the complexities of command. Hoepner's reflections on the campaign were marked by a sense of resolve and determination to learn from the experience. The realization of failure was painful, but it also offered an opportunity to reassess and adapt strategies for the future. In his final diary entry of the year, Hoepner wrote, The campaign has not achieved the success we hoped for, but we must learn from our experiences and adapt our strategies. The winter will be harsh, but we will continue to fight and prepare for the challenges ahead. Our commitment remains, even in the face of adversity. Early December 1941.
As December settled over the Russian landscape, the biting cold was no longer just a harsh inconvenience, but a formidable enemy in itself. General Erich Hoepner and his 4th Panzer Group had just begun to grasp the full extent of their failure in the failed push toward Moscow when a new threat emerged from the frozen expanse. The Soviet Union, having weathered the German onslaught and fortified their positions, was preparing a counter-offensive that would soon challenge the already overstretched German forces.
Soviet preparations. The Soviets had not been idle while the German advance faltered. Over the weeks of German operations, they had been meticulously preparing for a counter-offensive. Soviet General Georgy Zhukov, known for his strategic acumen and resilience, orchestrated a well-coordinated plan that would take advantage of the harsh winter conditions and the vulnerabilities created by the stalled German offensive. The Soviets employed a combination of deception and surprise. Under the cover of darkness and snow, they repositioned their troops and logistics. The Red Army reinforced their defenses and meticulously planned their counterattacks. Their goal was clear: to push the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow and regain lost ground. The first signs of the counteroffensive. The first signs of the Soviet counteroffensive became apparent in early December. Hoepner and his staff were initially skeptical, believing that the Soviets might be probing for weaknesses. However, it soon became clear that the Red Army's movements were more than just reconnaissance. German patrols and reconnaissance units reported increased Soviet activity. Communications from the front lines hinted at a buildup of Soviet forces preparing for a major operation. In a briefing with his senior officers, Hoepner expressed his concerns. "We are seeing increased Soviet activity. It is crucial that we stay vigilant and prepare for the possibility of a significant counteroffensive." The Soviet onslaught begins. On December 5, 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive erupted with overwhelming force. The Red Army launched a series of coordinated attacks along multiple fronts, targeting the weakest points in the German lines. The offensive was characterized by a combination of mass infantry assaults, artillery bombardments, and the use of newly available tanks and armored vehicles. The Soviet attack was swift and ferocious. Hoepner's forces, already stretched thin and exhausted from the earlier offensive, were caught off guard by the scale and intensity of the assault. The once solid German positions quickly began to crumble under the weight of the Soviet onslaught. Reports from the front lines described the chaos and intensity of the fighting. "The Soviet offensive has hit us hard. We are facing heavy artillery fire and fierce infantry assaults. Our defenses are being breached, and the situation is rapidly deteriorating." The struggle to hold the line. Hoepner's immediate priority was to stabilize the situation and prevent a complete collapse of the front lines. He ordered a rapid mobilization of reserves and reinforcements to counter the Soviet attacks. Efforts were made to regroup and fortify positions, but the challenges of winter warfare and the strength of the Soviet counteroffensive made this task increasingly difficult. The German forces, already suffering from fatigue and dwindling supplies, were forced to fight a desperate defensive battle. Hoepner's leadership was put to the test as he worked to coordinate a defense against the relentless Soviet attacks. In a conference with his senior officers, Hoepner emphasized the need for resilience. "We must hold our positions and adapt to the changing situation. The Soviets are determined, but so are we. Our defense must be resolute, and we need to regroup and counter their attacks effectively." The toll on German forces. The winter counteroffensive took a heavy toll on German forces. The combination of fierce Soviet attacks and harsh winter conditions exacerbated the difficulties faced by the troops. The already strained supply lines were further stretched, and the logistical challenges intensified. Hoepner's staff reported increasing casualties and equipment losses. The harsh winter, combined with the intensity of the fighting, was taking a significant toll on both personnel and material. the German forces struggled to maintain their effectiveness and adapt to the rapidly changing conditions. The impact on troop morale was also considerable. The initial confidence and resolve of the German soldiers were shaken by the intensity of the Soviet counteroffensive. Hoepner and his staff worked to address these challenges, providing support and maintaining as much morale as possible. The strategic reassessment. With the Soviet counteroffensive gaining momentum, Hoepner was forced to reassess the overall strategy. The possibility of a strategic withdrawal or realignment of forces became a critical consideration. The goal was to prevent further losses and stabilize the front lines while adapting to the new reality of the battlefield. Hoepner and his staff analyzed the situation and developed plans to mitigate the impact of the Soviet counteroffensive. This included prioritizing the defense of key positions, managing resources more effectively, and preparing for the possibility of a strategic withdrawal, if necessary. In a strategic meeting, Hoepner outlined the new approach. The situation is dire, but we must act decisively. Our immediate priority is to stabilize our positions and prevent further losses. We need to adapt our strategy to the evolving situation and ensure that we maintain a defensive posture when necessary. The road ahead. As December progressed, the winter counteroffensive continued to challenge the German forces. The Soviet attacks demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of the Red Army, and the harsh winter conditions compounded the difficulties faced by the German troops. Hoepner's leadership remained crucial in navigating the complex and challenging situation. The realization of the limitations and challenges of the campaign was a sobering reminder of the harsh realities of warfare. The path ahead was uncertain, but Hoepner and his forces were determined to confront the challenges head-on. The winter counteroffensive marked a new phase in the campaign, with the focus shifting to defense, adaptation, and preparation for the ongoing struggle.